Welcome to episode 3, season 2 of Cleveland State University's Psychology Club podcast. As usual, I'm Kevin, joined by Madhua, and in today's episode, we talked with Patrick Frato, who is a school psychologist, and he is an instructor in Cleveland State University's school psychology program.
Yeah, I think this conversation was probably the second conversation focusing on school psychology and topics related to that. And it's a nice complement to the conversation that we had with Dr. Shireen Nasir, who also talked about some of the topics that we might find here in our conversation with Dr. Frato.
Absolutely, and I think in a way, it also kind of complements our episode with Dr. Gansi, so that with her we got a clinical perspective, and from Patrick Frato we get more of an idea of like what's really going on in the schools, because he worked in the field for a while before he came to Cleveland State to work as an instructor. So with nothing further, we give you Patrick Frato.
Hello, Dr. Frato. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great. How are you?
Well, we're excited to have you on the podcast. One standard question that we ask all of our guests is basically, how did they get interested in psychology? So what's your story behind that?
Interested in psychology in general? Well, I think I'm probably interested in psychology for the same reasons that most people are interested, because once I started learning about psychology, I started to understand myself more, and other people more, and I think that once you start understanding the world better, then you become more comfortable in it and less concerned about things you don't have to be concerned about, and I think it gives you a better sort of sense of peace and well-being, and so I think there are just a lot of other curious things to study in psychology, and so I found it just an interesting field in general, and just became passionate about it from high school on.
Okay, so one thing that is peculiar about your profile is that you are a school psychologist. So we both were talking about it, is what is the role of school psychologist and how it differs from like a clinical psychologist who studies children and disorders related to children, and what does a school psychologist bring to the table that probably a clinical psychologist doesn't bring. So even with us, when we were talking about it, we had the ideas were not clear as to what is the special role of a school psychologist. So what would you say school psychology is first, and what is the role of a school psychologist in general, and how it differs from other psychologists?
Gotcha. So this is a great question, because most people don't know what a school psychologist is or what school psychologists do. And, when we look at sort of the folks who apply for our graduate program versus apply for the clinical folks always have, hundreds of people applying to their program, and we typically have 60 to 80, which is fine, but it's just a testament to the fact that I think when most people think psychology, they don't think school psychology, they don't know what it is, but you do know what clinical psychology is, because you're like, well, that's what Freud does, that's what a therapist does, and that seems really appealing, and that's why I got into school psychology, or why I got into psychology. I think that's why a lot of people get into psychology. So school psychology, there's certainly some overlap between that and clinical psychology and some of the other areas. We do counseling. We do, provide therapy and therapeutic interventions, but it's mainly with student age, the student age population from, K through 12 or pre-K through 12, so ages 3 through 21, you could say is what we're mainly focused, or the age group that we're mainly focused at. So school psychologists in schools, what do they do? I mean, it's almost a question of what they don't do these days. But generally speaking, the traditional idea of what a school psychologist does in a school environment is to give assessments and evaluations, and integrate all of that information into sort of like a coherent, picture of a child in terms of their strengths and their needs, and using strengths to come up with interventions interventions that address the child's needs, and monitoring progress to make sure that they are overcoming some of their academic issues or behavioral issues, social emotional issues. I mean, any sort of issue that could present itself in a school environment can be the school psychologist's issue to help address. And so we use a comprehensive problem-solving model. I mean, just as a physician might use a problem-solving model to sort of diagnose and treat, an illness and monitor the progress, school psychologists do the same in schools for behavioral, social-emotional, academic issues. So it's a pretty dynamic role that involves, I think, just a lot of different areas of psychology and need. And one's ability to apply all of those to any of those needs at any given point in time. And so it's fast-paced. You deal with a ton of different issues, in short periods of time. And it's a rewarding field to be in. So how does it differ from other forms of psychology? I mean, in clinical, whereas you may be doing more of the sort of counseling, or at least that's sort of what a lot of clinical psychologists do. You'll do some of that as a school psychologist, but you're probably heavier on the evaluation, problem-solving component than you are on the counseling component, although that varies from job to job. I mean, I've had jobs where I've been maybe 40% counselor, 50% evaluator, and then 10% problem-solving consultant. And then there have been other times at which I've been 100% or maybe 90% in the evaluation category. And then there have been other jobs where I've been more of like a systems consultant, where I've been sort of like a curriculum coordinator. So there are many different possibilities, in terms of roles that you can play as a school psychologist. And in the 4 jobs that I've had as a school psychologist, each one has been significantly different, and I might even say vastly different. And that's one of the neat things. You can sort of go through a 35-year career, however long you want to work, and switch it up every couple of years if there's something that you're interested in it, and there's a particular school or population that needs assistance, in an area that you're interested in sort of specializing in.
So is it possible in one role you might be doing more of like evaluating and then coming up with a plan for a specific classroom or even a student, and then somebody else, maybe like a counselor, is actually like implementing it?
1 second, guys. I'm sorry to interrupt. Let me move Mado's microphone. Patrick's microphone.
Oh, sure.
Yeah, so make sure you're talking. Don't talk directly into the microphone.
Okay, gotcha. Just kind of.
No, Patrick, you're good.
Oh, good. Okay.
Mado, you're just talking more to the side when I would normally pick you up on this mic.
Okay.
So I'm just going to change it, but we're all good.
Okay.
Didn't mean to interrupt. So Kevin, I'm
That's
going to
cool.
have you restart your question. Go on headphones and I'll cue you, and then I'll edit it together.
Okay, cool.
Sorry about that.
No, it's okay.
So is it that depending on what role you're in, somebody might be doing more of the evaluating and then coming up with like a plan that might be implemented by, like, say, a counselor or a teacher or like somebody else in that process?
Exactly. In most cases, the school psychologist isn't the direct implementer of the intervention. In some cases, they are, but yeah, we're helping to facilitate coming up with these plans, and we focus on evidence and research-based interventions to ensure that student outcomes are improved in whatever area of need is presented to us. So,
Go ahead.
Okay, I just read somewhere that being a school psychologist is one of the well-paid subfields within psychology. Am I right in thinking that?
one of the better paid?
Yes.
I don't know what other psychologists make, so I can't really speak to that. I do know that the compensation is fair. I think a starting school psychologist these days for a 9-month contract or a 10-month contract, so there's a great deal of time off. You're working between 185 days a year or, up to maybe 220 days a year. It's a good gig in terms of sort of life balance because you're working sort of school hours in a lot of cases. You've got these holidays, you've got snow days, you've got the summer off, and some more summer than others. But so they probably start in the range of $50,000 to $80,000 for those limited contracts. And the nice thing is you get paid throughout the year. So if you have something you want to do in the summer, like another job, or if you just want to travel the world or whatever, you're still getting paid and you've got your insurance. And so from the perspective of compensation and benefits, I think it's pretty high up there in psychology fields, but I don't know the compensation of other psychologists out there, so to be able to say that we're better or worse. So.
Okay, makes sense.
Have you seen a change? You mentioned kind of implementing evidence-based interventions since maybe the time that like you came into the field, and then has the research sort of changed the way that things are done in that amount of time, as far as like for what you've seen from your personal experience?
Yeah, my personal experience is there's been more and more emphasis on using research and evidence-based interventions, and that it's easier to locate those interventions through, the internet is certainly helpful. There are sites that have been improved and improved upon where, if you have a specific problem, you're working with a specific age of student, you can just kind of click on that and you'll get 10 interventions that, could address that particular issue for that particular age group that are all research-based, and they'll give you sort of the specific steps of what you need to follow in order to implement that intervention. So, there's a great deal of research that occurs in our field looking for evidence-based, research-based interventions, and sort of testing and retesting them to see what works best.
I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about your bilingual background, specifically Spanish and English, and talk a little bit about bilingual psychoeducation.
So after my third year as a school psychologist, I was in Reynoldsburg schools near Columbus. I had never had sort of the travel abroad experience in college, but I always wanted to have that. So I said, you know what, I'm going to, I really want to learn Spanish, but I don't want to take courses at Ohio State over the summer because, why? I should just, go to another country and immerse myself. So I moved to Argentina, and I for the first 3 months while I was there, I just took Spanish classes, at an intensive private school. And then once I felt like, I had sort of learned a basic level of conversational Spanish, I got a number of jobs in the country, and I thought that I was going to come back after that 3 months because it was just the summer that, I was there, summer here, winter there, which stinks, by the way. But then I wound up staying for, another year after that, and just learning Spanish better and doing a number of different jobs that I actually found on Craigslist in Argentina. And then after that time, I came back to Aurora Public Schools, which is right near Denver, and worked there starting up their bilingual evaluation team. And so the reason that I got the job there that I didn't know about until I arrived and they told me was that the Office of Civil Rights had come in and had sort of looked through a number of their evaluations. 200 of the evaluations they had been completed in the last few years at Aurora Public Schools. Evaluations for the possibility that kids were going to have school-based disabilities, and they had not included information about the child's first language, or had not given evaluations in their first language. And so my job was to go back and redo 200 of these evaluations to make sure that kids had these either IQ tests that had been administered in Spanish, or speech pathology tests that had been administered in Spanish, or academic tests that had been administered in Spanish, and then include that information in the determination of whether or not the child qualified for special education services. And so that was kind of my start with sort of bilingual psychoeducational evaluation. But the idea behind it is just that, okay, kids are coming into our system and they've got a native language, and then they've got their second language, which is English. And in some cases, it's their third language, and maybe they have an indigenous language, which is their first, and their second language was, Spanish, and then their third language was English. And in any case, you're trying to account for their ability or their skills in other languages, in addition to English. Sometimes you're trying to determine which is the stronger language and which evaluation you should give more credence to, and sometimes you're just trying to include that information or integrate that information to say, okay, their ability in English is this, their ability in their first language is this, and how am I going to integrate that information to understand them better, and whether or not this academic issue that they're presenting with is the result of them being an English language learner, or them really having a school-based disability or a disability that's impacting them, something biological. So that's what I was trying to do, just trying to tease apart, is this a language issue or is this a true disability? And using sort of my bilingual ability and ability to test in different languages to tease that apart.
I think that kind of gets into another question that we have. What are some of the challenges that are unique to Spanish-speaking students that are in a English-first kind of curriculum?
I would like to ask, along with that, I would also like to ask a broader question about this, because what you said is very interesting to me, because I come from India, where there's a lot of IQ testing happening, and sometimes we don't have the tests that are in the language that is their native language. So you end up having to test them in a language that is either the national language or the language that is English. And I think it affects the scores that the children get on those tests, and that kind of determines their educational outcomes. So I was wondering if when you do correct for the language, do you see an increased scores on those tests and stuff like that?
That's a really good question. I mean, when you correct for the language, do you see an increase in the IQ scores? And the answer is not always, okay. Because sometimes a child's first language is still not their best academic language.
Okay.
And sometimes the parents have sort of are concerned about providing their child with enriching first language experiences, because maybe they're in the United States and they say, well, I don't want to speak Spanish, for instance, to my child because I'm going to confuse them. And so they tried to speak their limited English to the child, and so they kind of create an impoverished language environment and background. And the issue with that then is that they don't have a very strong first language and they don't have a very strong second language. And so as a result, they just struggle on both of those tests. And so that can be a concern until they end up acquiring one stronger academic language, and that's a process with a lot of kids who are dual language learners. Is that sometimes the language development is slowed in both languages because they have limited capacity and they're splitting their efforts between two languages. But over time, I think that works itself out. They say it takes about 5 to 7 years at least to acquire, and this is what some research says, to acquire academic proficiency in a language that is not your first language. And so if that's the case, that's a long period of time to wait to give an IQ test to a student. And lots of times schools jump the gun on that because, after a year or two, a child's very much struggling. They're trying to figure out what's going on. So they give an IQ test, but the child may not have a strong language at that point in time. The score comes out lower, and then they use that maybe to justify special education services as opposed to English language learner services. So I guess the answer to that is you don't always see a higher score because there are other confounding factors. Then I think a lot of those have to do or could be corrected by the way in which we talk to families and work with families of English language learners before they get to school. To say, hey, first language is very important, because without a strong first language basis, it's difficult to build a second language. It's important to speak to your child, to provide enriching activities in a first language, to even do some academic work with them, or else it will be very difficult for them to build that second language. And in addition, if and when the time comes where they're given an IQ test or an achievement test or a communication test, in one of the other languages, if they at least have one strong language, then we'll get a better read on their ability or skills in that area than if both languages are kind of weak, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does.
Yeah, and then I mean, what are some of the challenges that are born out of that, as far as children that are, essentially being educated in like their second language, or one that they're not as experienced in?
Well, I mean, one of the things that we try to do in these classes for kids with English who are English language learners is to provide an environment that allows them to feel comfortable with taking risks and, making mistakes, so that, feedback can be provided to kind of correct those mistakes and whatnot, and to use language as much as possible. And this gets back to your question of challenges. When you're in a larger classroom, I mean, put yourself in the shoes of a child, who's coming over from a different place where they speak differently, they behave differently, there's different culture. To speak out and to take risks requires a great deal of courage that, understandably not every child has, and we shouldn't expect them to have that. And so that's sort of one of the difficulties with these kiddos is that without them sort of taking risks and speaking up in class and really engaging, then they're not going to learn as well. And so we need to provide these environments where they feel comfortable, where they feel accepted, where they can take risks, where they understand that it's okay to get feedback, because that's really what's required in the learning process. Anyone who's learned a second language and learned it well knows that you got to make mistakes. You got to feel okay. You have to feel comfortable. You can't feel like your soul is going to be crushed every time you speak up. Mm-hmm. You've got to be able to take those risks, and you got to be okay with getting feedback in order to correct and to improve. And so I think those are some of the biggest challenges, in various environments. And, to just as an aside to that, we're at a moment in our country where, folks aren't necessarily accepting, different people or immigrants as much. And so that makes it even more difficult for kids to speak up these days, and which is very unfortunate, because it's the last sort of pressure that they need, that will continue to be a barrier to them gaining that academic English and that confidence to really succeed in school.
Do you have next question?
I was just going to kind of pass it over to you.
Sure.
Doing some editing in this one. I'll
just point out while you're looking, I'm really excited to be on a podcast because I love podcasts. And, I listen to so many of them. And so, when Dr. McLennan was mentioning, that you guys are doing this, it's like, oh, I got to get on this. I'm glad that you reached out.
Yeah, I think that this was, I think we had kind of heard that you had mentioned that.
Yes.
I was like, oh, we should ask him then. So yeah, I was working from both directions.
I think these are great educationally, and for people to learn about new things, while they're driving, or for me, like it's gardening or whatnot. It's sort of my way of sort of making peace with the world.
That's true.
I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about, how like the research findings sort of like work their way eventually into being implemented into a school, like what that process is like, or, what might the lag be between like, okay, like there's a body of literature now around, a certain idea, and then now, like, however many years later, it's finally getting implemented, or was there talk a little bit about that?
So I'll say two things about that. That's a great question, because one of I think the frustrations of academia is that a lot of great work is done here, but it never makes its way out of the ivory towers, and how do we communicate all the things that have been learned here. And, these days, I think with, the sort of PubMed warriors, people just realizing the value of this tool, people, it happens. People are like, oh, I can go up on PubMed. Now, that creates another issue because not everyone understands research and the different sort of variables to take into account, in terms of what's high quality research versus what's not. But in the school psychology world, we have our own little niche, and there's sort of two ways, I think, I'm sure many more than two ways, but two definite ways that information is conveyed from academia to the practitioners out in the field. And one is our professional organizations. In Ohio, we have I think one of the oldest, if not the oldest, state organization in the country. And we have a fall and a spring conference where, you've got some of the latest research that is being conveyed to practitioners. We also have a national conference every year that is very well attended. Last year it was in Atlanta. This year it's in Baltimore, where you get some of the best researchers in the field who are presenting about their most recent work. To be able to convey that to practitioners. And so that works quite well. I think when I personally was a practitioner and would go to these conferences, I would come back just reinvigorated with a ton, like a notebook of information to kind of add to my practice. And then on top of that, it's students basically working as interns in school districts. So they learn the latest information, from graduate programs. Then they go into internship, and they pass some of what they've learned on to the people who are their supervisors in internship in the field, who may have been, or who may have been in the field for 30 years, and get sort of a refresher on, this is the latest, actually. And then the internet has really changed things up as well. The way in which various internet sites are, able to sort of aggregate, integrate a lot of this data and create these sort of engines, so that school psychology practitioners are just able to sort of like type in what they need, and it'll spit out a research-based intervention that's, and these websites are updated regularly as well. So I think modern technology and our professional organizations and our connection between the universities and practitioners in the field have really allowed for a fairly steady transfer of information from research to practice.
I'm curious about the role of ideas in guiding research and application. So I'm not very well read on these, but I know that there are some ideas about how teaching should happen, what is education, and how children learn and things like that. So do those ideas come into place while you're doing research, or maybe while you are actually doing the application stuff, like when you're working in a school? So there are some philosophical ideas. I'm blanking out on the name of a philosopher. I'm pretty sure but he's very influential within the field. So do you pay any attention to those types of ideas, or is it more like this is what the data says and we don't know what those people are saying? That's very idealistic kind of stuff.
Well, we are very data-driven in schools. I mean, we, like in terms of philosophy and ideas, sure. I mean, some of the hypotheses to, start our research may come from these ideas. But at the end of the day, it is what does the data say, what does the research say, and what do the meta-analyses say, on top of that, and are we able to does this research stand up to replication as well? So I think we are very numbers-based, very, very data-based. I mean, there is sort of an art side to school psychology, and we do suggest that, there are a number of, theories and types of ways of approaching things. But at the end of the day, I think that we're more on the data end and more on this is what the research says, this is what we're going to do.
You'd mentioned that in recent years, this is kind of something that's become more and more, important to the field is using evidence, as far as informing practice. But do you find that as it kind of is moving more this way, that you find stragglers that are kind of like, hey, well, this is how I've done it, and this is how it's always been done, and and if that does exist, that you feel like that's something that maybe will kind of like work its way out as we move forward?
Yeah, I mean, you're exactly right. There are lots of folks who are practicing in ways that are less evidence-based, but by using like projective measures, like draw a person and let's interpret what, your drawing of this person has to, what this means. There's a lot of that still going on. And, I don't always, poo-poo that and say, you don't know what you're doing. And there is something to be said for folks who've been doing things for a while and may have seen these sorts of things work, but the newer folks who are coming out of programs have been had it pounded into them that this is, we're focusing on what the research says and what the evidence says. But at the same token, we don't dismiss the idea that practitioners can learn things that researchers don't know, and that researchers can provide, or that practitioners can provide ideas for research And we have learned quite a bit from that. Like practitioners will say, well, you're saying this, but actually what I've seen in practice is this. That's important information. What's actually being done in the field and what's being seen clinically can inform research studies that can sort of corroborate what people are doing in the field. So I think it's important for people to pay attention to what's working for them and what's not working for them in the field, regardless of what the research says. I mean, we should try to do research-based things, but we should also say, well, if this is working, we shouldn't ignore it. Let's gather evidence to support what you're doing, and let's maybe talk to some researchers who can, validate, what you've been doing, such that more folks can begin doing it. So I think that things do work sort of bi-directionally. You've got the researchers doing the research and conveying what they've learned, and you've also got the practitioners saying, all right, this is what I've seen work in the field. Maybe you should do some research in this area because I think we may be able to substantiate its use.
So, in your experience as a school psychologist working in schools, what has been what has been some of the most challenging things that you have faced, and what are some of the solutions for it? So, it's just what I'm trying to get at is what are some of the challenges that you see today in schools with children, and what do you think could be the proper solutions for it?
Yeah, that's a good question, a big question. I think some of the things that have been most difficult for me to deal with, and I would say at least personally, are kids who are at risk of committing suicide. Those are difficult conversations to have with parents, difficult conversations to have with students. And in terms of solutions, I think that there's a protocol that we go through to determine sort of risk level to try to determine whether or not a child needs very intensive interventions for suicide risk or sort of more moderate interventions. But what is the solution to that? I mean, sort of more emphasis on mental health, helping kids to connect better with other people, those sorts of things that we talk a lot about doing, especially with school violence being such an issue these days. But we don't end up, providing funds for it. We don't end up actually addressing the problem. Like, how do we provide more mental health? We need more mental health. Well, what does that look like? How are you going to implement that? Where's the legislation? Where is the sort of the plan? And so that's kind of how I would address that overall issue. Other issues in schools, would say one thing that we talk about as school psychologists is that every child in the school should have a connection to an adult in the school where they feel trusted and respected. And we feel that that's one way to decrease sort of overall problems, like whether they're school violence, whether they're mental health issues, whether they're motivation issues, behavior issues. Every student should have at least one adult that they can go to, that they feel they can confide in, who trust them, who they trust. And so I think that's one overall solution, one thing that schools could do to decrease problems. And then finally, I would say that sort of the societal issues that kids bring into schools are big issues. The trauma that they come into schools with, and the realization that, kids come into school with a lot of mental health baggage, and that disallows them in many cases from concentrating on the academic work. And so before they can even do that, we need to realize that they need help coping with this stress and this anxiety. It's a stressful and anxious world. I think that the more we learn about psychology, the more we realize that people, generally speaking, are stressed and anxious. And kids are no exception. And kids especially may not be great at recognizing that they're stressed and anxious, may not know the difference between what it feels like to be stressed and calm, and so teaching them these things, teaching them coping strategies, taking them through these sort of coping skills on a daily basis through, quiet times or a little meditation times, deep breathing activities, kind of self-awareness practice, These are all important things such that kids can deal with the stressors of modern imperfect society where, things are very stressful at home and they've got to come to school and are expected to achieve at high levels. And how can they bring it down and sort of cope with what they've got going on personally such that they can concentrate on something seemingly abstract, during the school day.
Yeah, I can't tell if it's that. I'm sure it's a little bit of both, but that I am getting an education in psychology now, so of course I'm like a lot more aware of this stuff than I used to be. But it also seems like some of what you're talking about is starting to filter a little bit more into the mainstream, where it's not weird to see. I think I saw like on social media it was a clip of Oprah, I think, on a on a national talk show, like mentioning children like that are dealing with trauma, like trying to do some of the things that you're talking about, and how that's like a pretty big impediment. You can't just expect kids with a certain type of backgrounds just to do things that kids that don't have that background can do, because there's something going on there.
Absolutely. 6 years ago when I started this job, I took my graduate students to sort of a meditation expert to learn about meditation and mindfulness. And I was worried at that point in time. I was like, oh, maybe this is going to be seen as religion. Maybe like someone's going to say you shouldn't be doing this. And now it's everywhere. You go to our National Association's conference and everyone's presenting research about mindfulness and meditation in school psychology, or yoga in school psychology. It's very mainstream, but things have changed very quickly. The realization that these sorts of coping strategies and as applied to children can be helpful and can improve academic outcomes, because once we address that mental health side, kids can focus better on schoolwork, be less distracted, and perform better.
I think another tangential question to some of the topics that we were discussing is, how is it that your views about social justice informs what you do in school, and how certain problems are seen, or how certain problems are informed?
That's a great question, and one that I have been pondering a lot lately, because when I started in this field, I think the idea of social justice was not a political thing, and it's always been part of our National Association's sort of ethical standards that we believe in social justice. We believe in sort of equality for everyone, and having an equal chance sort of at great educational outcomes, and so it was a really neat thing for me to be part of the field and part of our professional organization, because I felt very connected to that idea that there should be this fairness, this justice, this equality, that was pervasive in our practice and in our service delivery. And so I think that one of the ways that informs practice is constantly, considering one's biases, considering where you've come from, how you grew up, the privilege you do or you do not have, the way that you connect to particular students, the way that they may see you, and the way that may influence how you score an IQ test, for instance, that you give. The way, like, there's an idea of I'm blanking on the exact term, but you see a child who maybe is particularly attractive, you like their personality, you automatically think they're smart for that reason, so you've got a bias going into testing and you're scoring them better because of that. It may also be you see a child who is from a minority group and you're worried about scoring them too low because of your bias, but then you end up sort of like scoring them too high on a test or something like that. So thinking about bias, trying to be as objective as possible, trying to be fair as possible, trying to support fairness and equality for students, and thinking about situations in which students are alienated or disenfranchised, trying to make sure that you're inclusive. Lots of times I talk about the school psychologist being the person in the school who is connecting with the student that no one else is connecting with. Teachers maybe for some reason find disagreeable, is other educators the same, and so it's the school psychologist's job to say, no, that person needs to be included, wherever they come from, whatever their background is, whatever makes them disagreeable to all these other people. We're the ones who could connect to them. And so for me, personally, social justice is all about fairness, inclusiveness, justice, and kind of keeping that objective mindset in sort of everything that we do, and trying to kind of bring harmony to the environment to say, this is a multicultural place. We accept that. We appreciate that. We think that adds richness, to enriches the experience of education, and we're going to support all the children here and try to do so in an equal way, such that everyone has an equal shot.
I think that's a great place to end the conversation, and we'll finish it up with a question we always finish up with. But what advice do you have for any undergrads who are psychology majors or are considering a psychology major?
So, considering a psychology, my advice would be to explore all the different areas of psychology, because there are many, and you've got cognitive psychology, perceptual psychology, biological psychology, and sort of that end of like the brain end, and then you've got the clinical end, which is, just as scientific on the other end, but in sort of a different way, in sort of more of a social way. And so explore all the areas of psychology, try to determine which you're most passionate about, which you're most interested in, and how you might turn that into a career in one way, shape, or form. I don't think that graduate school is required for all psychology undergraduate majors afterwards. Like, there are plenty of ways in which psychology can be transferred to sort of the job world right after a bachelor's degree. So explore all the different areas of psychology, see what you're passionate about, talk with your professors about fields that you could go into after your undergraduate. And make a determination based on that. But don't feel like you have to know what you want to do as soon as you start out in undergraduate. Feel free to explore. You got the rest of your life to figure out what you want to do. And you should think pretty hard about what you want to do, and not just, for instance, take the advice of someone else, who just said something one time and latch onto that and say, well, that's what I'm going to do. And now that that's what I'm going to do, I feel better about my life and my direction. But really try to think hard about it, because your life's important and you're going to spend a lot of time, working in a particular career. So you ought to really explore and think hard about it, and think about what you like to do every day. And like, what do I like to do? Do I like to be moving? Do I like to sit? Do I like to work with people? How does that translate into sort of what I want to study and what I want my path to be?
I think you made a really important point there, and you brought up a lot of stuff that I think or I know that I've been I've struggled with myself and as far as like deciding on a major and then deciding on psychology, and then that's a pretty broad field. Like, how do I want to narrow that down? And you mentioned latching on to what somebody said, because that sounds pretty good, and like I can kind of have a thing that I want to do with my life right now. And I've had those moments where it was kind of like, okay, cool, like I know what I want to do, like it feels good just to know that, but then it's like, but is there some more work that needs to be done here? Is this really the thing I want to do? And almost not wanting to do that because it felt so good to like have an idea where my future was going, but it ultimately being like
not the
like
right
yeah
fit.
and worthwhile to really question it and say like, okay, wait a minute, do I need to do some more like due diligence here as far as like where it is that I'm heading?
Yeah, and uncertainty never feels good, but it's a necessary, I think, process. It's a necessary discomfort during this process of exploration. And I'm always impressed by the students who have the patience and the willpower, the discipline to really search out what's going to be an intelligent path for them, as opposed to saying, well, my mom or dad did this, so I just decide that this is what I'm going to do too, which, no offense to folks who do things that way, but I think that it is the more difficult path to really sort of, meticulously decide what you want to do and talk to a lot of people, not jump on one thing just because certainty feels better, but to say, my life is important. This is going to be a long career. I've got to be happy with what I'm doing, all day for work. And ideally, I would like to be passionate about it and feel that this is sort of a unique contribution that I'm offering to the world.
Thank you so much. That was very well put.
Yeah, thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks for inviting me. This was a lot of fun.